Hello everyone, Ray Stendall here. Thanks so much for watching this video. This video is all about taking a look at how do we go about optimizing the employee work processes inside of an organization such that you can develop an organization that is employee-centered so that you can ultimately be customer-driven. So one of the things that we need to first talk about when we are on this subject is taking a look at hiring practices. How does your organization go about and acquire talent? How do you go about taking a look at the requirements of your organization and making sure that there is a fit between the people that you recruit and the values that you have, the beliefs that you have, and ultimately making sure that the person who joins the organization is going to be able to support a culture that you yourself are architecting and carefully putting in place. The ability to recruit a team member is one of the most important skills that human resources needs to do. Frankly, I'm not even a big fan of the word human resources. A human is not a resource. A machine is a resource. So let's just scratch that terminology and say one of the most important things any organization needs to be able to do is to be able to attract people with talent so that we can add value in the marketplace. So one of the suggestions I want to make to you from taking a look at some of the organizations that are very employee-centered and customer-driven is to hire for personality and hire for innate skills and train for job-specific skills. So you might ask me, what exactly do I mean? Well, you see, if I'm going to hire somebody into an organization, I'm going to be looking for things that I can't teach them. I can't teach them to be energetic. I can't teach them to be truthful, honest, to have integrity. I can't teach them to be organized. These are things that they either have or they don't have. I can't teach them to have an attitude of being excited to serve customers and to serve fellow employees to get the job done. These are attributes that I've talked about earlier on and we'll talk about again. Attitudes, beliefs, character traits, and habits that you can't train for. So the first thing I should say to you is take a look at these aspects that you cannot really train for. The second thing is it's important when you go through the interview process to go through multiple rounds. Consider the following as a suggestion. Have multiple rounds with multiple goals for each round with multiple people who interact and interview a candidate. So, and I'd also do it in multiple different places. So here's an example. Let's suppose that you have a 4-round structure and in each round you have a different place that you meet. So you get to observe the person in different places. For example, the first place that you might observe them would be in the work environment. The second place you might observe them might be in a restaurant. The third place you might observe them might be together with other employees in a group panel kind of environment. The key idea is you want to change and put them in different situations so that you can observe as many data points as possible. The second key point is have different people interview the same person. It's important to have different people who are likely to interact with this person interview them. Somebody who's senior, somebody who's a peer, and somebody who is junior. Being able to get this 360-degree view of a candidate is very, very important. The next aspect I would take a look at is making sure that the job interview is behavioral based. Don't focus on things that someone can regurgitate off of a resume. Focus on watching how somebody thinks. That's what you're hiring. You're hiring somebody's ability to think, to use their mind, to add value to your organization, to meet the expectations that customers have, and not only that, to exceed them. So one of the things that you want to take a look at is put them in behavioral-based situations where you say, imagine you're in situation X. How would you do this? How would you accomplish Y? Or use historical types of questions. Can you give me an example when you were in this situation and how did you handle it? The more that you do these types of questions, the more you will make the candidate think, and the more that you can observe how they think. Even give them a pen and paper if you want them to put together a process or write on a whiteboard. Get them to engage in the thinking process. The thinking process is actually much more important than the final result that they give to you. But many people skip this and they just stay at the superficial level. Now, once you go through and you hire somebody, I want to suggest that you follow an idea that Zappos has made pretty popular, and that is offer to and bribe them to not take the job. That's right, offer and bribe them not to take the job. You see, if a candidate who is just about to get a job to work in your organization is willing to accept a pretty juicy bribe, in the case of Zappos, they offer $2,000 to not take the job, then you know that they weren't really committed to staying with the organization in a longer term capacity. So determine for yourself what an appropriate bribe is and use this as an ultimate test. It's much better to get rid of somebody at the beginning of a process than to hire somebody who's not a good fit and only to have to let them go later on. The next key idea I want to share with you is probation. It's important that everybody realizes that when somebody comes on board, they're on probation. They're on probation for you and them to assess if a really good fit exists. So now that you've hired somebody, what's the next step from an employee work process standpoint? The next step has to do with culture indoctrination. That's right, culture indoctrination. In order for you to indoctrinate your culture onto them, it implies that you already have a well-defined employee culture. And there is some culture tools that I'm going to be talking about in this series. But the key thing with culture is it has to be built on a set of values. It has to be built on a purpose and a mission that the organization has, a way of doing business. If you do not have this at your root of your organization, every additional employee that you bring on board will not be indoctrinated, which means you will have a culture by accident and not a culture by design. So as you go through the process of indoctrinating your people into a culture, you want to teach them what your company way is. And I would recommend that you actually have some structured classes that explain what your company is about, what your history is, what your purpose is, what your goal is, and how you treat internal and external customers. Employees need to understand what is acceptable behavior, what is not acceptable behavior. And through this process, as you indoctrinate people into your culture, you're also going to pair the individual up with different people in an organization. We'll talk about mentorship in a little bit later on in this video series, but it's important that new employees have people that they can go to ask questions in a semi-relaxed environment without having to feel that they're going to somebody higher up in the organization to get some basic feedback and guidance. Now here's the next point, training. Training is really important, but I want to suggest there's two types of training, and I'm willing to bet one type of training most people in your organization are probably not doing. There's two types of training. Training number one is obvious. It's job-specific training, how to do a task. Now, in many organizations, it's called on-the-job training, and this is what it looks like. Hey, join the team. All right, now that you're on the team, go and do X, Y, and Z. I don't know how to do X, Y, and Z. Well, go take a look at it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll help you out. This is very ad hoc type of training, and for smart individuals, in certain circumstances, it can kind of work. But really, the best type of job training involves being able to get very clear in helping an employee understand the inputs to their job, the outputs, the expectations for the methodology that's used, guidelines, and ultimately giving them lateral control in terms of how they go about to solve problems to get jobs done. As part of this process, you help them build a methodology and a process. And you don't let them just flounder in the wind to try and figure out their own methodology and their own process. You help them with templates. You help them with tools. You give them something they can emulate. You give them a person in the organization who is an expert in a certain field and can be a resource. Now, let's talk about that secondary of training. It's customer service training. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that, well, that's for people in customer service. No, no, no. Customer service is everybody's job. Everybody has a customer, either internal or external. And if you don't have an external customer, by golly, your customer is the internal ones that do serve the external ones. So when we talk about customer service training in this context, I'm actually talking about picking up the phone and talking to real end user customers. Why? Because it's important to realize that everybody's boss is the end customer. The end customer is the one that votes with their dollars. They take money out of Hip National Bank, to borrow an expression from Mr. Ron LeGrand. They put it on the table and they vote with their dollars. So that means the customer has to be respected. As part of being part of an employee-centered and customer-driven organization, you have to understand what it's like to interact with a customer on the line, Hear the customer complain. Hear the customer be happy. Hear the customer's positives and negatives and feedback, and ask questions and be able to address them. And if you don't have the answer, to get the answer from another team member. I think all employees in all organizations should spend some time in customer support, and do so on an annual basis. If more people would spend time dealing with the customer, you would have a drastically different overall demeanor when you are not directly facing a customer. So that's my second key area that I think every organization must do. And while I didn't mention it in the first video that talked about executives, I think every executive in every company must do a tour of duty, and that is picking up the phone and talking to customers in the call center. That's right. The only way that executives can understand the pain in the marketplace and the frustrations of process is to actually be on the front lines. And many leading companies do this, and I want to recommend that you do as well. So the next aspect here has to do with motivators. You know, all individuals are motivated by various things, and some things are very basic and some things are a little bit more complicated. But let me ask you this. When was the last time across your organization you had a really heart-to-heart conversation about an employee's career path and help them realize that this is not just a job, this is a career that is developing, where you're building new skills and moving up the corporate ladder to have greater autonomy, greater control, greater responsibility, or they're achieving other objectives in a career. It may not be a management track, maybe it's a technical track. Whatever is relevant to the employee and where they want to go. Many organizations have what is called review sessions, career planning sessions, but really all they are check boxes to check in some type of system that says to human resources that we have had a conversation and a performance appraisal. Really? Do you really think that's sufficient to be able to get employees to get to the state of truly feeling loyal and going the extra mile? I'm talking about having employees that are willing to drop what they're doing to help someone in the organization, whether it's during business hours or not. For example, if you're an organization that provides 24-hour support to your customers and you're on the late shift working from midnight to 6 a.m. and something critical happens and your site goes down, do you have somebody that you can call that is at home sleeping that can help you? Maybe it's a colleague. Do you have that kind of rapport, and do you know, will they answer the phone? Organizations that are truly kicking butt in the marketplace have relationships that go above and beyond, because there is that culture, that je ne sais quoi, to use a French expression, that's present, that makes people want to contribute. So another key thing I want to talk about in terms of motivators is taking a look at so from an employee engagement standpoint, how do you really know that you have employees that are engaged? It's a question that I think is quite challenging, because a lot of organizations don't fully monitor and engage employees in a way that's objective. You see, if you ask if your employees are engaged and they feel that they will be punished if they say anything but yes, and yes emphatically, then that's not a true measure of engagement. So I ask you, when you look at your organization, how open are you to truly objective feedback, and what do you do with the feedback that you get? Now, coming back to talking about motivators, well, of course, there's compensation to talk about. Now, one of the things I want to ask you about with compensation is, have you been able to institute something called partnership pay? Partnership pay is where, when the company wins, the employees win. Directly. There's a direct correlation. And the more that you can make an employee an entrepreneur inside of your organization to produce an output that favors the company and the marketplace by going above and beyond, making them think innovatively and independently, the more you will be able to cultivate a workforce which is highly motivated, because they know that they get paid extra for making the company successful. So that's something that I want you to consider. And it goes much more than thinking about a program that is based on a commission structure. But that is, of course, one area that you can take a look at. Here's another thing I want to ask you about. How do you go about acknowledging employees in a public environment? We all know that we want to be acknowledged for the work that we do, but how do you go about doing it? I challenge you to think about this. Is it on an annual basis at some convention? Is it more regular than that? Do you have an employee of the month? How do you go about doing it? And how important is it to the employees that they are acknowledged? Is there anything that goes along with it beyond simply having their name read out on a newsletter or announced from a microphone somewhere? Do you put your money where your mouth is when you acknowledge somebody? So these are some things I want you to consider. Now, the next area that I want to take a look at is trust. Trust is such an important factor inside of building an employee-centered organization, because let me ask you this. How do you actually empower employees? Think about it. I'm willing to bet that you think it's more complicated than it is, and I've already kind of given you an answer. The answer is you trust them. That's right. After you have done a great job of hiring them, training them, indoctrinating them into your culture based on your values, your beliefs, and where you're headed as the purpose for your organization, then the next step is to trust them. Trust them to use their judgment. You hired them because they have a set of innate skills, an ability to think, a passion to serve customers. So trust them. Now, will they make mistakes? Absolutely. They will absolutely make mistakes. But see, this is where you get to separate amazing management from average management. Amazing management will say, my employee made a mistake. I had to pay for that mistake. But that was also a learning lesson. And let me make sure that it was a productive learning lesson. Did the employee learn what the mistake was? Do they know what they'll do differently next time? And now, is this a more valuable employee to me than somebody who didn't make that mistake? They're more valuable. Of course, big mistakes can sink the company. I understand that. But I'm willing to suggest that the majority of mistakes are not going to sink the company. And the way you respond and treat an employee who's made a mistake says so much more about the way you view empowerment and trust than anything else that you could possibly do inside of an organization. Now, I want to suggest that you build a budget that allows an employee to take action to solve a customer problem on the spot, especially if you know the lifetime value of a client. The Ritz-Carlton hotel chain is pretty famous for giving each employee a $2,000 budget to solve problems. And they can do so at their discretion because they know the lifetime value of a customer is significantly more than $2,000. Well, how do you go about empowering your employees to solve problems on the spot? And do you give them a budget to do so? This is an important piece that I want you to really consider. And I want you to make it the de facto standard in your organization for employees to say yes to solving problems, and make the exception no. Let them ask for permission to say no to a customer, and by default say yes. I hope that registered. That's a really important key concept, and it's one that you can use to really make some massive improvement in your organization. Now, here's another key point. Let's talk about mentorship. Mentorship, everybody knows having a mentor is important, but really ask yourself, what type of mentor-mentee relationships really exist in your organization, and what are you doing to foster them? Do you help pair together people who are likely to have a good fit? Are you involved in connecting with both parties to make sure that they actually get value from connecting with one another, and that there is a personality fit and a career fit? Do they have scheduled meetings? What are the outcomes of those meetings? You see, every organization must consistently be thinking about two things. One, how do I help my existing employees get to the next level in their career? And how do I bring on fresh new employees through this funnel? You see, the problem with organizations that are stagnant is that their employees are stagnant. They are stuck in a role, and they clock in and clock out, and they get bored. If you don't want to have that problem, you have to think of yourself as a train of employees that are moving up the structure, that are expanding, unfolding, growing, and are able to contribute in a greater capacity because they have been groomed in the culture that you have set in place. That's very, very important. Great organizations build paths for their employees to move up and across. Stagnant organizations have employees that do the same thing day in and day out, year in and year out, decade in and decade out. And guess what? The employees get bored. So finally, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is feedback mechanisms. A feedback mechanism is one in which you truly create listening posts throughout the organization, as well as outside, but I'm going to be talking about it from an inside perspective, so that you can really understand what is on the mind at a logical perspective and on the heart emotionally as it relates to your employees. Now, I know that might sound like a bunch of wishy-washy language, but I got to tell you something. Your employees are emotional creatures. You are an emotional creature. And the more that you understand an emotional creature, the more you can get the best out of them. That's what leadership is about. It's about getting people to follow you because they believe in what you have to say, where you're going, and how you plan to get there. So I want you to have feedback mechanisms, listening posts in place. I want you to collect this information, do so in both objective manner, do so in a way which is where privacy is ensured. But most important, you have to display all of the feedback. You have to display it in a public forum. You have to be authentic and transparent. Just think about it this way. If you have an employee who offers you feedback, and then when you go to review all the feedback with all the employees, that person's feedback is not included, how does that employee feel? How likely are they to contribute feedback in the future? So that's step number one. Step number two is you have to openly discuss the good and the bad. You can't hide around things you don't want to talk about. Number three, you have to prioritize what you want to work on and provide some explanation for why you're working on some things and why you're not working on other things. If you just selectively pick the projects that you just wanted to work on from the very beginning, employees will know that management will do whatever management wants to do. So that's a key point for you. And then finally, you must circle back on what you did relative to the feedback and then re-examine if you've made progress with your employees being the judges. So I hope you found this video very useful. It's my intent to provide content to you that is new, innovative, and helps you really think about your organization. All of these things are challenging to accomplish all at once. And there are very few organizations that are hitting it out of the park in all of these dimensions. Some of what I've shared, you might say, yes, I already knew all about that. And some of you might even say that all of this is very rudimentary and could be found in any management textbook. Well, the answer is, and the reality is, that most companies are really not firing on all of these cylinders. Maybe it's because management isn't sufficiently motivated. Maybe it's viewed as a dream that cannot be accomplished. But I have to tell you, the organizations that are truly moving forward on these ideas, you know them because they are world famous for what they do. And we'll talk more about those companies later on in this video series. So this is Ray Stendall, and stay tuned for our next video in this series.